Hi guys. Zoom has been down and I've been trying to figure it out, but I haven't been successful so far. But first day of the semester, we don't need to freak out. Just grab our coffee and just yeah, have it on a protein shaker, of course, and keep calm. I'll do the lecture. I'll go around it. I'll do the lecture using another software, but I can share my screen while doing it. So at least for this one chapter, please, as you are watching this, make sure you open the PowerPoint slideshow on another screen or somehow you have it in front of you so you can hear my voice and also go over the slides. I will try to pinpoint where I am and what I'm doing. All right. It's not gonna be a huge video because it's a very short slideshow, a small chapter, and it's in a very introductory, and that's how I wanted it to be the first week. Okay, so um, the very first thing we need to know from this chapter is what is sport and exercise psychology, right? So we're talking about studying people and their behaviors while they're doing some kind of activities that have to do with sport and exercise, and how we can take that knowledge and apply it. That's um, that's the a way to define sport and exercise psychology. Now, that's a pretty recent definition, 2017. Now, when we talk about psychology, we usually talk about ABC. And when we talk about sport and exercise psychology, we also talk about the ABCs of psychology. So we have A, which is the affect, which is our feelings, right? And then we have the behavior, which is how we act based on those feelings. And then, of course, we have the cognitions, which are our thoughts, which again can be based on feelings or actions or so on and so forth. And then there's a D added, which is and an E that has to do with the environment. So all these happen, our feelings, our actions, our thoughts are an environment which is dynamic and ever changing. So that helps us understand the context of psychology, and more particularly the context of sport and exercise psychology. There, as you can see, there are plenty of videos in those slideshows that help you understand more. I'm not going to play the videos unless they're very, very important. But I would recommend you watch those videos. They're very informative, and they add, they make those slideshows more interesting. All right. In general, we're trying to understand two things. We have two objectives, two more specific goals in sport and exercise psychology, and one has to do more with the sport part, and another one has to do more with the exercise part. And of course, we're trying to understand how our psychology affects our performance, and then how after we participate that can have an effect on our psychological factors, right? And there are many different questions that we can use as an example. For the first one, which is again to understand how our psychological factors affect our performance, you can ask yourself, like, how does anxiety affect a basketball player's accuracy in free throw shooting, right? Does imagery training facilitate recovery in injured athletes? And then when we see it from the other perspective, does running reduce anxiety and depression? And we're going to talk about things like that, right? Does participation in college athletics enhance personality development? And we have a couple of student athletes in our class. So there's a bi-directional relationship. Psychological factors affect our performance, and our participation affects our psychological factors. Okay. Now, a lot of time when we talk about sport psychology, we think about elite athletes and how we're going to help them perform better. But as you can see in the next slide, sport and exercise psychology, especially exercise psychology, applies to a very, very broad uh, population base. So you can see, of course, we have the elite athletes and the coaches and the trainers, but also we have, any youth, seniors, any kind of athletes that just do recreational athletics, anybody who is participating, just to participate. There's no professional aspiration. There are no sponsors, nothing like that. So you just even just go to the gym to feel better, or to lose a couple of pounds of fat, or to gain a couple of pounds of muscle. So a lot of things that we're going to talk about throughout the semester, and especially the exercise psychology, right, applies to broad population base. Now, again, this chapter is very introductory, and when you are a sport and exercise psychologist, you can do a lot of things. You can be a researcher, okay? You can go online, for example, put my name on Google Scholar and see what you're getting, what kind of results you're getting. And like my expertise, my research interest is mental toughness in sport. So that's what I do. So I do research, and then we report the findings. A lot of times I have collaborated with students, right, like yourselves, and we have gone to conferences with them. Of course, that was before COVID, but our last trip was with two students, and we went to Texas, actually. We've gone to New York plenty of times. Also, Minneapolis, maybe. So there are a lot of conferences that we go with students that are participating in research. Anyway, psychologist can be a researcher, can also be a teacher, right? For example, right now, what's happening, I'm teaching a university course that has to do with sport and exercise psychology. And also you can be a consultant, right? You can be somebody who can, we usually call them mental coaches. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And you give advice that has to do with very specific things. And by saying very specific things, you'll understand a little bit when I distinguish a clinical psychologist versus an educational psychologist. But you can definitely do consulting, okay? All right, these are the leading organizations that we have. Next slide. ASP, which is the Association of Applied Sports Psychology, really important. And then when we talk about APA, American Psychological Association, there's a very specific division, which is called Division 47, that has been created specifically, especially for exercise and sports psychology, and there are more of them out there. This is the North American Society, of course, for the Psychology of Sport and Physical Activity. And then I go to the next slide and I give you some journals. Those journals are really important for several reasons, but there's one additional reason, because those are journals where you can find those peer-reviewed articles that you will pick for your final learning opportunity, right? So you see here Journal of Applied Sports Psychology, Journal of Clinical Sports Psychology, Journal of Sports Psychology in Action, and so on and so forth. Sports psychology, of course, a big one. Psychology of sport and exercise. All right, let's talk about the specialties for a second. Right? We can group them in general, the psychologists, into a clinical sports psychologist and an educational sports psychologist. Psychology specialist. So when we talk about a clinical sports psychology, we're talking about disorders, right? We have a psychologist, and we're talking about eating disorders, we're talking about substance abuse, we're talking about, for example, depression, suicidal tendencies. Those are the cases that these people are going to go to a clinical psychologist, right? Now, the educational sports psychologist is different. The educational sports psychology specialist, he is not, or he and or she, they are not, cannot be called psychologists because they're not licensed psychologists, right? Those are the people who not only understand psychology but also have training in kinesiology in the general spectrum of exercise science, right? So they're more interested in, in game anxiety and issues that directly affect performance. They're not going to go into clinical issues. Those are for the clinical psychologists. Now, can an athlete go to both of them? Sure. But an educational sports psychology specialist, which is usually called mental coach, right? Coach, not psychologist. If they are trained to see some signs, if they see that potentially that person could be diagnosed with a clinical case, with a clinical disorder, they have to refer them to a clinical psychologist, right? So the clinical psychologist may be working on, I don't know, some issues that have to do with body image, and the educational mental coach can work on anxiety during free throws. Okay, so they're kind of similar, but at the same time they're different. And figure 1.1, you can see the domains, the different domains, how they overlap, how they are connected, but also how they're different. So me being an educational specialist, I have that training that has to do with kinesiology and motor learning and sport pedagogy. I'm not somebody who's trained in clinical psychology or personality psychology or any kind of that part, right? All right, if that's clear, we'll talk a little bit about the history of psychology. It's not, I know most of the time when I'm in class, it's not like the most interesting topic, but I want you to see how much we've evolved, right? So usually when we talk about sports psychology now, it's kind of, it's established, it's an established domain, it's established field, but of course, it wasn't like that some 100 years ago, right? So the history of psychology, usually we start like at 1880, and we break it down into 6 parts, and those are the 6 parts we're going to talk about. So you see those 6 periods, right? The early years and so on and so forth, all the way to now. Now, the very first period, one thing that I would like you to remember is Norman Triplett. He did a very cool experiment. That may sound pretty basic right now, but he observed that cyclists, when they train with others, they tend to perform better because they compete with each other. And that was very interesting back then, as you understand. Also, as you see at the end of the next slide, 1918, we start talking about, Coleman Griffith, and that will be a very important thing because Coleman Griffith will really devoted a part of his career in psychology, and he's being regarded as the father of the American sports psychology right now because of that. Now, if you go into period 2, you see that we have a lot of publications coming from Griffith. A lot of labs are being created, as you see, like Germany, Japan, Russia. That was really important back then. Period 3, we have mainly Frank Henry, and we owe him a lot, because not only he published a lot and he researched a lot and he pushed sport and exercise psychology forward, but he also trained so many people in Berkeley that all these, like, people that graduated his program continued his work in established sports psychology even more. You see there Dorothy Yates, one of the very first women that were in sport and exercise psychology, and she used kind of imagery and those relaxation techniques that had to do with college boxers, and she created an intervention that so that it worked for those boxers. And that's something that is important, and I would like you to remember from that period. Period 4. Now we're in, like, as you can see, mid-60s. PE, physical education, is already established as an academic discipline, and as a result, you see a lot of publications. You see the first annual NASP-SPA conference, which is again a milestone, as you understand. And then as we go to period 5, we're now like mid-70s all the way to late 90s, and we have tremendous growth. You see the Journal of Sports Psychology now is established, and we also have Dorothy Harris. I'm going to talk about Dorothy Harris in a little bit because we'll have a slide that is specific for women in sport and exercise psychology. But you see, like, 1985, U.S. Olympic Committee hires its first full-time sports psychologist, another milestone, right? But in general, you know, there's that tremendous growth, not only like in North America, but globally. Before I go to period 6, what I want to say is, like, you see 1991, the American Association of Sports Psychology, AASP, establishes what we call right now the certified consultant. Again, I want to pinpoint that we're not calling them psychologists. They're consultants. Okay, that is different. They're not psychologists that come from the APA route. These are different people who have that exercise science background and are specialized in exercise sports psychology, but they're mental coaches, right? They cannot be called psychologists because they're not licensed psychologists. Period 6, it's all the way to now. So we see that now we are part of a vibrant and exciting field, and you see that in 2000 we have the Journal of Psychology of Sport and Exercise, which is huge, and then APA established the Division 47, that is that specialized area that has to do with sport and exercise psychology. What else? Yeah, and there's a bright future in front of us, right? And as we're coming towards the end of this slideshow in the first chapter, which is very introductory, I want to just spend a couple minutes here just to talk about women in sport and exercise psychology, and especially about Dorothy Harris, that you will see her name. You see 1970s and 1980s. We talked about Dorothy Yates. Now I want to just spend a couple minutes about Dorothy Harris and say that she was the first female member of the International Society of Sports Psychology, the first woman to be awarded a Fulbright fellowship in sports psychology, and the first female president of the North American Society of Sports Psychology and Physical Activity. So she was a true pioneer. That's it. Before I finish this video, I will just I want you to go to Moodle, and I'll go myself and just confirm what we have due for this Sunday. Okay, hopefully Moodle will work. It's been an interesting day already. Hopefully things will just get better. I understand it's the very first day of the semester. All right, it's loading. That's a good sign, right? All right, so for Sunday, we have the extra credit learning opportunity. You will see it in that very first week on Moodle, all the way up, August 24th to August 30th, right? And also we have LO1. So we have two things to submit, ECLO and LO1 until Sunday, August 30th at midnight, right? Also, you can play with Learning Game 1, LG1. That has nothing to do with your final grade. That's only there for you to practice, because we're talking about the learning games are going to be a matching assignment, and also there's time associated with that assignment. That's all from me for now. If everything goes well, I'll be uploading my next videos for chapters 2 and 3 next Monday, tomorrow office hours. Let me know if you need anything. In the meantime, lift intentionally, not habitually. Bye, guys.